You once claimed that you have an ability to face unpleasant facts. Is that what you've demonstrated in 1984 by drawing an accurate portrait of the future?
I think that allowing for the book being, after all, a parody, something like 1984 could actually happen. This is the direction the world is going in at the present time. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
Welcome back, everyone. In this week's episode, I'll be talking about privacy in the UK. In particular, the UK government forcing Apple to either provide a backdoor or remove access to the ADP feature, that's Advanced Data Protection. Now, this is primarily a show for listeners in the United States, but I still think this is very relevant. In fact, this could be a story that lands on our very own doorstep in the not too distant future. At the end of the show, I'll also be answering listener questions before we wrap up. Now, I do want to take a moment, as always, to thank my supporters over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/The Lockdown. I've had some very new members join recently, and I really want to thank you for joining. You are the reason that I can keep this show completely free of ads and sponsorships. So for that, I truly do appreciate the support. All right, let's get into this. Apple has made a move that should concern anyone who values their privacy. No surprises there. They pulled ADP, that's Advanced Data Protection for iCloud. Now, this isn't a minor security tweak. This is Apple rolling back encryption protections at the request of a government that wants access to more of your data. Now, for those who are not familiar, ADP is an opt-in feature, or was in the case of the UK, that allowed Apple to beef up security in iCloud. It basically ensures that only your trusted devices have the keys to unlock data in iCloud. So even Apple itself couldn't access things like your iCloud backup, photos, notes, reminders, that type of thing. Essentially, your data was for your eyes only. But now, if you're in the UK, you don't have the option to turn that on. That said, let's just break down how ADP works. I think this is important. When you turn on ADP, your encryption keys are no longer stored on Apple's servers in their data centers. The idea is those keys are only stored on your own trusted devices. So that's your iPhone, your iPad, and so on. Now, in theory, no one can access them, not even Apple. That's the core premise of end-to-end encryption, that data is encrypted on your device and can only be decrypted by you or the other end. So if this works as intended, it can't be decrypted in the cloud, not even by Apple, and certainly not by third parties demanding access. So when you opt into ADP, a few things are happening in the background. First, your device informs all of your other trusted devices. That's assuming you're logged in with the same Apple ID. And it does this through iCloud Keychain, writing a new value that basically says, hey, we've got ADP now, so just go into lockdown mode. Now, according to Apple, this isn't something even Apple can tamper with. So once you flip that switch, Apple servers should have no ability to remove or modify that setting. Now next, and this is really important, your device initiates the deletion of all keys from Apple's data centers. These are the keys related to ADP and iCloud. That means that the keys that were previously stored on Apple's hardware, these are hardware security modules, or HSMs, it's how they store keys. Before ADP, Apple technically had access to decrypt your data if they needed to. But once those keys are gone, Apple no longer has any way to read your iCloud backups, your photos, your notes, or any of it. The deletion is permanent and irreversible. But here's the issue I have with that process. Apple tells you that once the deletion request is sent, those keys are gone forever. But let's just think about this realistically. Technically, Apple servers could ignore that request. It could make a copy of the key before they delete it. There's no way for us as an end user to audit or verify the key was truly erased and not copied. So if a government agency demanded that Apple retain those keys before deletion, how would we even know? This is why I personally don't trust processes like this with closed source proprietary solutions. And it's exactly why I wouldn't have recommended ADP in the first place. My private keys have to stay with me always. I never want them sent to the cloud, ever. Now, I do wonder how many Apple users in the UK were actually using ADP in the first place. This was a feature you had to turn on, and turning on ADP means Apple can no longer help you recover your data. It comes up with a warning, I think, when you turn it on. So if you forget your password or you lose access to your devices, don't set up a recovery contact, then your data is gone forever. Now, this is a feature, not a flaw. It's intended for privacy, which means that no one, not even Apple, has a way back in once that lock has been engaged. But one other point I would like to make is ADP doesn't cover everything in iCloud. Certain types of data like your iCloud mail, contacts, calendar aren't end-to-end encrypted and not protected by ADP. That's just the nature of email and calendar syncing. Encryption is possible, but not in a way that Apple could fully control. So if you think of Proton Mail, for example, I can send an email from myself to another Proton Mail user, and that's fully encrypted end-to-end. If I send an email to a Gmail account, well, obviously there's no way I can have end-to-end encryption in that case. Now back to ADP and the problem here. Why is this happening? The culprit is the UK government, obviously, and their Investigatory Powers Act, better known as the Snoopers Charter. Now this law gives the government extensive surveillance powers, including the ability to demand access to stored data, intercept communications, and even force companies to undermine their own encryption. But here's the thing. I don't think most iPhone users were using ADP anyway. By default, iCloud backups were already accessible to Apple and by extension to law enforcement agencies that present a legal request. ADP was a step in the right direction, but now that option has been removed. So what does this mean for you? If you are in the UK and you're using an iPhone or iPad, whatever it is, and you rely on iCloud, then don't. Your data is vulnerable. This is what I would do about it. Number one, stop using iCloud. I think this is non-negotiable. I would consider anything in iCloud as accessible by Apple, a data breach, UK government, whoever. Disable iCloud backups, remove your files and ensure your photos aren't being synced to Apple servers. In fact, I had a message from my father this morning on Signal and he said, "Oh, have you heard this news?" And obviously we had a chat about it. And I was actually quite impressed that he said he doesn't use iCloud, he doesn't use backups, he doesn't use shared photos, he doesn't back up his photos. And I was quite impressed because I assumed that everyone uses Apple devices because of these convenient features, but perhaps not everybody. But either way, if you're using an Apple device, I would not recommend iCloud. And next, I would consider moving to GrapheneOS. Now, I know I talk about this a lot, but Apple is showing once again that it will always prioritize compliance over user privacy when they are pushed. If you truly care about your security and your privacy, it's time to look at the alternatives. And in my opinion, the only alternative is GrapheneOS. Now, I've had a few comments and I heard people talking about this recently, asking if they can install social media apps or this, that and the other. GrapheneOS is not a flip phone or command line only interface. It's the Android operating system. It's just significantly hardened. So yeah, you can have TikTok and Instagram if you like. You can be logged into Google. You can basically make it less secure if you wanted to. But by default, it is hardened and you're not going to have all these back doors opened up by governments. Okay, if you must stay with Apple, use Nextcloud for file syncing and storage. I've said this before and I'll share a link in the show notes because I've written a very in-depth blog of setting up Nextcloud. Now, I get it. This is for the more technical of users. Installing Linux and installing Nextcloud and presenting it with network-attached storage. It's not for everybody. But Nextcloud has the ability to back up your photos to your own servers on your own network. And if you want, never touching the internet at all. Now, if Nextcloud isn't an option, then I would normally recommend SyncThing, but SyncThing doesn't have a native app available on iPhone, but there is an alternative with Mobius Sync, and this is another way to sync all your files without relying on the Apple ecosystem. Now, backups. I personally believe there is no need to back up your device, whether that's an iPhone or GrapheneOS. If you're doing everything properly and you're using Signal, MySudo, Nextcloud to sync files, then what are you actually backing up? You should have no data generated or anything critical on that device that you need to back up. the worst thing is you buy a new device, you have to reinstall the apps again. Now, I mentioned my sudo, and there is a caveat there. The way I back up my sudo is I have it installed on my iPad, and then I back that up to an encrypted backup in iTunes, not iCloud. That way I do have my sudo on more than one device. So should I lose my GrapheneOS device for whatever reason, at least I have it on another device and I can restore that way. There's also a recovery password that's set, and I store that in KeePass. As far as I understand, and if anyone can correct me here if I'm wrong, there is no way to back up my sudo, certainly on a GrapheneOS device or any Android device for that matter. And the way my sudo works is if you lose access to your account or your numbers, they cannot restore it for you, which is good. That's what I like. It means governments can't access that either. And I believe also to sign up for their payment plans, depending on which option you go for, you have to have a way of paying. So I do that on my iPad. It's not ideal, but it's a good workaround. So I don't back up my devices. If I have to get a new phone, I'll install GrapheneOS from scratch. I install my apps from scratch. But because all my data is on my servers, which are backed up, things like Nextcloud, even my contacts I store in my sudo. I don't use the device's contacts. So I don't rely on anything device-centric to store my data. And then this one goes without saying. If you're using Apple iMessage or FaceTime, then just stop. It's just tying you into their ecosystem, if anything. Now, we had Key Jeffries on in the last show talking about session. And I think if you listen to that episode, you will realise that this isn't for everybody. It's not quite ready yet for the mainstream. Things like voice and video calls are not that smooth. I've had issues with it in the past. This is why, personally, I still recommend Signal. I'd say 90% or more of my friends and family are using Signal now. They know that if they want to get hold of me or send me a photo, they have to use Signal. If you want a video call, use Signal. That said, there are still one or two that, for whatever reason, I say, here's my Signal username, message me on there, but they just ignore me. They don't even respond and say, oh, I don't want to. They just don't reply. So I don't know what that is. Maybe they don't understand what Signal is. But to me, if these people that have TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, what's an app like Signal going to do? It takes 5 seconds to install. But anyway, next, I would always use a VPN. Now, on an iPhone, I would install the Proton VPN app. But even better, have an always-on VPN while you're at home. I have a guide on that as well, so I'll put a link in the show notes using pfSense. And then finally, just stay updated. Always make sure your iPhone or iPad is up to date. But while talking of updates, I must state that Apple are very sneaky. They keep enabling Apple Intelligence and Siri. So if you've disabled Apple Intelligence in the past, and then you've done an update, if you go into Settings, Apple Intelligence, you will find they've enabled it again. You have to keep going in and turning that off. That does infuriate me, which is again why I don't take them seriously when they talk about privacy. I don't want any more features. Features like Apple Intelligence and Siri should be opt-in. I don't want that turned on without me knowing about it. So the bigger picture here is this is, I think, bigger than Apple itself. This is about the ongoing battle between us, the privacy enthusiasts, and government surveillance. Every time a tech company caves, it just embodies governments to ask for more. They will say, oh, this is about national security, or we need to prevent a crime. But in reality, these powers rarely stop with their initial intentions. Once a backdoor is created, it's just a matter of time before it's exploited in ways that it wasn't originally meant to be. Now, I first heard about backdoors in the 80s when I watched War Games. In fact, episode 18, if you listen to the intro, you'll see what I'm talking about.
I can't believe it, Jim. That girl's standing over there listening and you're talking about our backdoors?
It's crazy that we're talking about backdoors in 2025. If there is a backdoor to encryption or some system, it's just a matter of time before a threat actor or a nation state like Russia or China, Iran, North Korea, whoever it is, finds a way to access it. It's only a bad thing. I think the problem with most of the governments, especially in the UK, is they're a generation of people that just do not understand how technology works and how encryption works. And they're making decisions based on ignorance. But Apple had the chance to take a stand here. They could have fought this law, or at the very least, they could have made it clear that they wouldn't comply. Instead, they just pulled ADP from UK users with no fight. And if history has shown us anything, it won't be the last time a government asks for more access. Now, I don't think this is a big deal for the majority of the listeners of this show. Now, I do have Apple devices. I have an iPad, but I'm not using iCloud. I don't take photos on that device. I'm not using it for contacts or calendars or mail, anything like that. It's very limited in what I do. Now, yeah, Apple's decision is disappointing, but it's not surprising. So if you want privacy, hey, let's move to GrapheneOS. What's stopping you? Okay, on to some listener questions. Now, a listener writes in with a privacy concern, saying that their photo was recently posted on Facebook by a college. Now, I'm assuming it's a college they went to. They requested this be deleted, and they did comply, which is great news. But they go on to say that their friend was basically very dismissive over their concerns, saying privacy is pointless, that everything is already public, and trying to control your exposure is a waste of time. Unfortunately, this is a mindset that we all see from time to time. Some people think because some of their data is already out there, then they've just lost all control. But that's the wrong way to look at it. It's the same thinking that people use when they say, well, Google and Facebook already have my data, so why bother? Now, this kind of attitude is exactly what keeps people from taking any control of their privacy in the first place. Now, the reality is privacy is cumulative. Every step you take to limit your exposure, remove old data, and prevent future collection does make a difference. It's a difference between being fully exposed versus being a much harder target. Now, I think what your friend probably doesn't understand is the concept of threat modelling. Now, privacy from a practical point of view isn't about being 100% invisible. It's about reducing unnecessary risk. Sure, your photo might be online, but why make it easier for bad actors to collect, exploit, and misuse your data? You are not protecting yourself from corporations, you're protecting yourself from stalkers, identity thieves, social engineers, government overreach. You don't know how your threat model may change in the future, and it could happen overnight. So my takeaway on this is just keep requesting takedowns where you can. It is always worth it. Stop feeding the machine, use aliases, control what does get published, and limit exposure going forward. Don't let people who don't take action convince you otherwise. Their indifference doesn't mean you should stop caring. And I think finally, your threat model is yours and yours alone. Your friend's risk tolerance might be lower than yours, but it doesn't make it right. Okay, next question. Someone wrote in and said the UK government is forcing Apple to backdoor encryption. Apple disables ADP in response. What's next? Hopefully the previous segment answered that question. But first, if you've been pushing your family towards Apple for security, I get it. I do the same. Historically, Apple made privacy simple. You enabled some settings and things just worked. But the cracks have been showing for a while, and now this is where we are. Now, will I be telling my UK friends and family to move to GrapheneOS? No, of course not. Privacy isn't a one-size-fits-all. We all need to understand our threat model and strike a balance. Another way to think of this is a spectrum. Let's call it the threat spectrum. No other spectrum involved here. This is just a threat spectrum. And the way I see it, everyone falls somewhere on that spectrum when it comes to privacy and security. For example, on one extreme, you have the people who prioritise convenience above all else. They fully embrace Home Assistants, they post daily on social media, they sign up for anything and everything that looks interesting, and they willingly trade their personal information for these small comforts. Automated shopping recommendations, tailored content feeds, the list goes on. They're not thinking of the long-term consequences of data exposure at all. And even if they do, they just say to themselves, well, I've got nothing to hide. Okay, then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the extreme privacy enthusiasts, like our friend Michael Bazell, JJ Luna, or even the fictional characters like Brill from Enemy of the State. Now, these are the people who live off-grid, can't be found unless they choose to be. They use burner devices, Faraday bags, virtual identities, compartmentalization strategies that are very complex. It doesn't always suit the majority of us with day jobs and family. Now, they're not just practicing good digital hygiene, they've actually removed themselves from modern tracking ecosystem almost entirely. I would say, though, that most of us fall somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. Maybe we need to recognise the privacy risks of big tech, but we also live in a world where we need to engage with it to some degree. We have jobs, we have responsibilities, personal and professional obligations. And for someone like me, I like to lean towards the extreme end. I do want to be invisible. I want to be that person that if someone searches for me, they come up with nothing. But that's not always the reality, and certainly not with my career. For me, my job requires me to speak publicly at security conferences, participate in webinars, even share my expertise with the public, which I'm doing now on a podcast. That means, for me at least, there is a photograph of me out there. There are headshots. My voice is out there. So the question is, I think, is what sacrifices are you willing to make? And for those people on the extreme end, they won't use credit cards in their name. They won't have any social media, and they certainly don't sign up for any service that demands an identity. That may mean cash-only transactions, physical security measures, even relocation to areas with minimal surveillance. So moving out of state would be certainly something on their agenda. And for them, the extreme privacy enthusiast, it's not just about limiting exposure, it's about making sure that if anyone were trying to track them, they would just hit a dead end. But if you work in a field, I've actually had other listeners, in fact, message me about this, and they too work in fields that do require visibility, like I do. So you do have to accept that total anonymity is off the table. And that's okay. The key is finding a balance, taking control over what's exposed while minimising what's unnecessary. So threat modelling then, it really is about asking, what am I trying to protect? Who am I protecting it from? And how much inconvenience am I willing to accept for that protection? Now, if my UK friends and family are just casual users, using their phones for WhatsApp and email and streaming services, they probably don't need GrapheneOS. They do need basic security hygiene. So that's strong passwords, a password manager, two-factor authentication, minimal data sharing, and avoiding unnecessary cloud services. Whereas for someone like you and I, where privacy is a higher priority, running GrapheneOS on a de-Googled Pixel phone makes sense. But I think for the majority of my friends and family who rely on Apple services and have no real technical knowledge, they're just trying to keep their data away from mass surveillance, moving them off iCloud, getting them to use Signal, setting up local backups. All those things are far more practical than throwing them deep into this hardened OS they probably won't understand how to even install. So I think it's important that when we're recommending privacy techniques and security as well to our friends and family, that we don't push them into solutions that don't fit their actual threat model. You don't need to go full tinfoil hat mode, as much as it's fun for us, if privacy is your biggest concern. But if you're a journalist, an activist, or someone in a high-risk profession, even a celebrity, then we're talking about different steps. You have to use hardened devices, air-gap systems. You have to use end-to-end encrypted communications and minimise all unnecessary digital footprints. Now, back to the listener email. You've already gone ahead with Proton Mail and Signal, so that's a solid switch from iMessage. And you've got local backups. I think you're using iMazing and Tailscale. I haven't used Tailscale. I've used, what's the other one? Zero Tier. iMazing, I've not got much experience with, but the fact you're consciously making decisions over secure backups is great. But if you want to go further, you need to look at how you can de-iCloud your iPhone as much as possible. So as I said earlier, turn off iCloud completely. No backups, no syncing, no photos. Use Proton Drive or Synology if you have a NAS for photos. Just make sure that's not exposed to the internet. Now for notes, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, I'm not a fan of Joplin. Standard Notes is fantastic. Doesn't work for me. I already have thousands of notes in text files already in Markdown format, and I don't like the way Standard Notes handles those and converts it to its own, I think it's Super Notes format. So for me, Obsidian is the best note-taking tool out there. I store all my notes on Nextcloud. It treats them as files, just Markdown files, but Obsidian has an amazing plugin ecosystem as well. I wouldn't go crazy with plugins, but one of them I really like is Tasks. You can do a hyphen for a bullet point, do a space, open square bracket, space, close square bracket, type something. Now you have a checkbox. You can add dates, priorities, and for me, for tracking my daily tasks and even showing what's high priority versus low priority, what I've got outstanding for the day or the week, it's actually very powerful. You can do a lot with Obsidian. Contacts, I use my sudo to store contacts. I'm not sure if it's the best place, but that's where I store them at the moment, and they're divided by each of my sudo profiles. And as for calendars, Proton Calendar, it's not the best, but it's secure. I trust it. It works. So don't burn everything down overnight just because of what's happened in the UK. Gradual migration works too. I think the biggest thing is getting your data out of Apple's grasp and into services that don't betray our trust the moment a government makes a demand. You're already thinking in the right direction, so I think now it's just a matter of executing on your plan. Will I be doing a full deep dive into securing an iPhone? Probably not. I'd rather spend the time walking you through setting up GrapheneOS. I'm thinking about doing a video. It's just very time consuming. So something that's on my list still for the future. All right, it's time to wrap up the show. But before I do, some closing thoughts. I've had a number of emails from many of you that have said that I've filled a void after Michael Bazell stopped the Privacy, Security and OSINT show. First, I want to say that these are not shoes I can fill. He, in my opinion, is the king of extreme privacy and OSINT and continues to do great work at Intel Techniques, as well as his books and online magazine. While I appreciate the sentiment, and I admit that Michael has been a huge inspiration for me, my intention is not to follow the same path. I'm really not worthy of that. As many of you know, my background is very different, with cybersecurity and coming from the UK. In fact, it was the month I landed in the US when I discovered his podcast. That was when it was Michael and Justin. Now, having a wife and kids presents significant challenges with privacy, hence the title of my show being focused on practical privacy. As much as I would love to be off-grid, grow a long beard and operate under the radar entirely with nothing but an axe and a log fire, maybe some chickens and a GrapheneOS device, I have a day job, which, let's face it, has a certain level of expectation in regard to my public persona. As I said before, you will not find it very difficult to find my headshot from a recent or upcoming security conference. This is why I talk about threat models, and this is why I'm trying to strike a balance. Now, I did toy with the idea early in this podcast of including OSINT, and the reason being is I'm a huge advocate for OSINT in the enterprise, so in the corporate world. OSINT is critical with cybersecurity. Threat actors use OSINT techniques to understand and do reconnaissance about the workforce, who the IT admins are, what technology they're using, who they report to, who their colleagues are. If organizations aren't using those same techniques or doing OSINT, they're leaving themselves vulnerable with a significant gap. But that's a very different angle to OSINT than Michael Bazell is taking. He's doing active investigations every single week, which I am not. I'm looking at OSINT from a defensive point of view, is how are people getting my information, where is it, and what can I do about it? So if you have questions or any updates or feedback for the show, you can email me at lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. Now, thanks again to the Patreon members. And on that note, one of the perks of the redacted tier of membership is that I share my session ID so you can message me directly. But I do wonder if we'd be better off using Matrix. That's matrix.org, which is an open source, decentralized communication protocol designed for secure end-to-end encrypted messaging, VoIP, and file sharing. But this would not only allow you as listeners to message each other, anonymously, of course, but it would allow me to set up private channels to share updates and talk to you directly. Let me know what you think, if that's worth pursuing. Now, I need to pack my bags because I'm heading somewhere tomorrow. And by the time you listen to this, I just may be in Washington, D.C. at the SANS OSINT Summit, or maybe I'm in the mountains growing my privacy beard. Talk soon.
What's backdoor?
Well, whenever I design a system, I always put in a simple password that only I know about. That way, whenever I want to get back in, I can bypass whatever security they've added on. That's basically what it is.